Let's talk about CSS variables or CSS custom properties. And as you can see here, I have my HTML CSS course folder open. And so I'm going to create another section here, and this will be the section 4 of this course. So let's go ahead and get into the section 4. I'm going to create a practice folder, and this will hold all the concepts that we are going to practice in this section. And so let's go ahead and create a folder for our variables. And I can just drag and drop this on my VS Code or Visual Studio Code icon here on my desktop, and I have that open. And so we can go ahead and create our index HTML and our style CSS file. I'll go ahead and have my skeleton, my HTML skeleton here. I'm going to remove the meta tags because we have not talked about meta so far. And right below the title, I'm going to have my link to the style sheet as the style.css file. And here in the body, I'm going to have an h1. And I'll say CSS variables. Come on, variables. Below the h1, I'm going to have a paragraph. And I'll do lorem just to have some dummy text in there. And now below the paragraph, I'm going to have a header. I'm going to have an h3. And I'll say this is a sub heading. Just like we did for the CSS units. Okay, I just want to have something here. And you know what? I'm going to have another paragraph here. And in there, I'm going to do lorem 20. And now below this paragraph, I'm going to have a div. And in this div, I'm going to have another h3 or maybe an h4. Now say this is a div heading, something like that. And now below the h4, I'm going to have another paragraph with lorem 20. Okay, so this is the structure I want to work with. I have an h1, a paragraph directly inside of the body. Below that, I have a header which has an h3, a paragraph, and a div. And in the div, I have an h4 and a paragraph. Simple. All right, we have our CSS connected or linked, and we have our live server here, so we can just go live. And I have my project here on the side. Now I'm going to shrink the VS Code a little bit. Okay, that's it. Just so we can see whatever is happening here live. So let's get into the CSS. I'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit. So 125 should be good. I'll target the body. And I'm just going to change the font. Okay, so the font family, I'm going to do Arial. I'll save that, and we have Arial font here. Now, what are CSS variables? CSS variables are custom properties that allows you to define reusable values in your CSS. All right, so let's say we want a color for the text on our page. We can go ahead and define a CSS variable, and we can reuse that variable over and over again, right? So let's go ahead and declare or define a CSS variable. And to define a CSS variable, the variable has to start with 2 hyphens or 2 dashes, whatever you want to call this. Right, so you have 2 hyphens, and then you define the variable name and then the value you want to assign to this variable. So it can be black as a color, it can be 50 pixel as a pixel value, it can be 10 rem as a rem unit, it can be a font family, so we can do Arial here. It literally can be any value in CSS, right? So that is CSS variable. So in this case, I want to set a color for my CSS here. And so I'll go ahead and say primary color. And I'll assign this to be blue. And I'll just go ahead and choose a slightly darker blue here. And I'll save. And you notice nothing happens. Now let's try using the value or the variable somewhere on our page, right? The variable holds the value, right? So let's try targeting an element, and we are going to target the h1 element. So I'll say h1, and I'll give that a color of the variable that I just set. And to use the variable, use the var function, and then you pass in the name of that variable. So in this case, we have 2 hyphens and then primary hyphen color. That is the name of the variable. So now I save, and you can see the color for the H1 is now blue. Of course, I can go ahead and change this to red. And once I save, instantly you can see, of course, that's not red. I'll just change that back. You can see now this is actually dark red. Okay, I can make it red for you to see that clearly, and there you have it. We can of course go ahead and target another element, and here I'm going to target the div element inside of the header. Okay, so I can select the header and get the div, and I can change the background to be the variable, right? So that's primary hyphen color. That's the name of the variable, and now we have a red background for the div. Now of course, if I go ahead and change this to any other color and save, now instantly all the elements using that value instantly change to match the value of that variable. If you have used variables in any other language, then you know how important variables are. And this page we have here is very small, and so it doesn't really do justice to how important variables can be in CSS. So you could argue that this is very small, or this a very short page, so you can go ahead and paste the value just like we have been doing so far, and of course you will get the same result. But imagine having thousands of lines of CSS. Some border colors have this value or are using this value, some gradients are using the value, some colors, some backgrounds are using the value. This saves you a whole lot of time. And it's also very important when it comes to creating dark and light theme functionalities. And we are going to get into that later on in the course. But just bear in mind that CSS variables or CSS custom properties is one of the most important things you should know in CSS. So let's say you didn't use CSS variables for your project and your client wants you to change the primary color for his brand. In that case, you have to come into your code, go ahead and change this to whatever color that you are updating it to. Let's say you want to update the color to, this bluish color. You have to go ahead, copy, and then paste that color wherever you find it. So you can see how stressful it is going to be if you have, thousands and thousands of lines of CSS, right? So CSS variable saves you a lot of time when it comes to, stuff like that. So I'll just go ahead and revert this to what we had before. I'll save, and, we are now using the CSS variables. Now let's talk about the scope of declaring your CSS variables, or where you usually have to declare your CSS variables. And we basically have two scopes, and currently we have the local scope, and that is what we have here. We have the primary color in the body selector, and in this case only the descendants of the body are going to have access to this variable that we've declared. And so let's go ahead and actually cut this. That's the primary color. I'm going to cut that, and now I'm going to select the header element, and I'm going to paste the custom property in here, or the variable in here. And once I do, you can see that now the H1 does not have access to the variable, although we are using the variable on it. Now I can of course drag this up, and still the same thing will happen. And that is because this H1 is not a descendant of this header element. Now of course this div is a descendant of the header element, and that is why the background has the red primary color. Now if I go ahead and select this element right here, which I think is an H3, let me check that real quick. Yep, right here is an H3 inside of the header. If I go ahead and grab that right here, so the header, and then we get the H3 inside of it, we can go ahead and change the color to be the variable. So primary color, I'll save that, and as you can see our H3 is now red. Now I can of course cut this one more time from the header, and now I'm going to put this inside of the div. So I'm going to paste that in a div, and once I save, now the H3 has no access to the variable. So that is how variables generally work. We have the local scope, and this is what we've explored so far. So this is generally not the ideal way, or not the best way to declare your CSS variables. but rather you use the root element, which is the HTML element. And to select the root element, you do not use the HTML tag, but rather you use a colon and then root, like that. And then in your curly braces or curly brackets, you can go ahead and have all the variables that you need for your website. All right, so here I'm going to cut the custom property or the variable we have here in the div, and I'm going to paste that in the root. So I'll just paste, I'll save, and now every element on the web page has access to the root variables or the variables in the root scope. Now, of course, I can go ahead and have another variable, and I'll call this fav-font, and this area, I'm going to cut that and bring that up here. And now I can go ahead and use that variable here using the var keyword, and in the brackets I can go ahead and say fav-font. I'll save, and now we are back to the Arial font. So this is usually how you want to be using your variables. You put all the variables that you need throughout the project here in the root scope, and with that, all the elements on your web page are going to have access to the variables. When using or accessing a CSS variable, you can have a fallback just in case the variable is not available. All right, so for instance, if we come down here to where we are using the colors, we can have a fallback here as well. Okay, so you have your variable and then you have a comma before you have your fallback. So in case the primary color is not available, we can do blue. And now once I save, nothing happens because the primary color is set up top right here. But now if I comment that out and save, then we have a blue background. And notice only the div here has been updated because that's the only one with the backup or the fallback. And so let's come down here to the H1, and of course we can have a fallback on that as well, and we can use any fallback color we want. I can do yellow. I don't have to stick to this right here. I can use whatever fallback color I want. I can do purple, and that will be the fallback for this H1. And now here I can do any other color, maybe green. But consistency is very, very important in design, so maybe you want to use the same fallback. And for the most part, you are always going to use your CSS variables anyway. You're always going to declare them before you start using them. And so you may not be using the fallbacks as much, but it's just something you should know about. Now let's quickly go ahead and have one last variable. I'll say card padding, and I'll do 1 rem. I'll save, nothing happens. I'm going to put that on a div, so I'll say padding, and I'll access that card padding. And now we have that. Of course, I can target any other element, maybe the body, and have a padding on that as well. And I'll say card padding. And of course, I have a padding for the body as well. Now, just because I call this card padding doesn't mean I should use that on a padding property. I can even change this to be a margin property, and I'll have a margin of the value that I set for this. And in this case, that is 1 rem. Of course, I can do 2 rem, and now I'll have 2 rem of margin here. Okay, and then 2 rem of padding here on the div. I hope that makes sense. So that is all for CSS variables or CSS custom properties.